Inside Pelican Bay, Guard-Orchestrated Gladiator fights exposed. If you think you know what really happens inside maximum security prisons, think again. Hit subscribe, drop a comment, and buckle up. This story will change the way you see justice. The screen fades in on a gray Northern California coastline shrouded in fog. Beyond the crashing Pacific waves rises a vast concrete fortress, Pelican Bay State Prison. Built in the late 1980s as California's answer to the era's surging gang violence, it was billed as an impenetrable Supermax facility. To the public, Pelican Bay was a symbol of order, a place where the state's most dangerous criminals were locked away, far from society. But behind those walls, according to court records and sworn testimony, a secret blood sport was unfolding, a grim spectacle that would later be called the Gladiator fights. The story begins in the Security Housing Unit, the SHU, a windowless labyrinth of cells measuring 8 by 10 feet. Inmates spent 22 or more hours a day inside these concrete boxes, eating alone, exercising alone, speaking to no one except through vents or under the flicker of fluorescent light. The SHU was designed to break gang communication. But in the early 1990s, its sealed doors hid more than isolation. Rumors swirled among prisoners and lawyers. Correctional officers were deliberately releasing rival gang members into the same yard, knowing violence would explode. One of the first people to raise the alarm was attorney Steve Fama of the Prison Law Office. In 1991, he received letters from inmates describing orchestrated confrontations. "They're calling them gladiator fights," one prisoner wrote. "They let us out 2 at a time and stand back." Another wrote of guards laughing from behind riot shields as blood pooled on the concrete. At first, the stories sounded like paranoia born of sensory deprivation. But then came medical reports. Lacerations, puncture wounds, broken bones, and incident logs that didn't match the injuries. Inside the prison, tensions were combustible. Rival gangs like the Mexican Mafia, Nuestra Familia, Aryan Brotherhood, and Black Guerrilla Family all had members in the SHU. They lived in isolation but nursed decades-old vendettas. The only thing preventing bloodshed was the strict separation policy. When that policy was breached, even accidentally, the result could be fatal. According to later court testimony, some officers saw this as a tool, a way to control the yard by letting enemies injure each other while gathering intelligence from the aftermath. Prisoners called it the program, a cynical game in which their bodies became pawns. One former Pelican Bay officer, speaking years later under a pseudonym to a local paper, said he had watched colleagues manipulate yard assignments. "They'd know who was who," he recalled. "They'd put 2 enemies out there and wait. It was like lighting a match." Officially, the Department of Corrections denied any policy of staged violence. But inmate affidavits described guards yelling, "Who wants to go?" and signaling which door would open next, as though refereeing a match. Some even claimed they were promised extra phone time or privileges for fighting, claims the state has never confirmed. In 1992 and 1993, the violence escalated. One incident left an inmate paralyzed after being shot by guards breaking up a fight that the prisoners claimed was staged. Another ended with 2 men bleeding out on the yard while officers held back medical aid until the scene was secure. These stories filtered out to families and to a handful of journalists who specialized in prison reporting. Among them was Don Thompson of the Associated Press, who wrote a series of articles that caught the attention of federal Judge Thelton Henderson. Henderson had already overseen prison reform litigation in California. Now he was reading affidavits about what sounded like state-sanctioned cage matches. As lawyers prepared a lawsuit, investigators pieced together the prison's internal culture. Pelican Bay's SHU staff had been trained like a paramilitary unit, black uniforms, boots polished like mirrors, shields and batons lined up like an arsenal. They called themselves the Goon Squad, a nickname some wore as a badge of honor. For new officers, the message was clear. Toughness ruled, and inmates were the enemy. That environment, critics argued, created conditions where orchestrating violence wasn't unthinkable, it was sport. Meanwhile, inside the SHU, prisoners whispered through vents and tapped codes on pipes to warn each other of impending yard releases. "They're setting you up," one would tap. "Stay down." But the cells were soundproofed, and warnings often came too late. Inmates fashioned makeshift armor from magazines under their shirts, hid sharpened plastic to defend themselves. Some refused yard time entirely, sacrificing their only hour of fresh air to avoid an ambush. The public still knew almost nothing. California newspapers were focused on rising crime rates and three strikes legislation. Politicians boasted that Pelican Bay was a model of control. But then came Madrid v. Gomez, a civil rights class action filed in 1991 on behalf of SHU inmate. Named for lead plaintiff Jesus Madrid and warden James Gomez, the case alleged a pattern of brutality, including the so-called Gladiator fight. Over months of testimony, the curtain began to lift. Jurors heard about Von Dorch, a mentally ill prisoner scalded in a tub by guards. They heard about a paraplegic inmate left in his own waste. And they heard, in chilling detail, about rival gang members released into yards like fighting dogs. By late 1994, the federal courtroom in San Francisco was a theater of shame. Inmates described being told to fight or die. Former officers described a code of silence. Medical experts testified about untreated wounds. The state called its own witnesses to deny everything, but documentary evidence, incident reports, photos, internal memos, painted a different picture. When Judge Henderson issued his 1995 ruling, he stopped short of declaring the fights a formal policy but condemned Pelican Bay's SHU as an environment of systematic indifference to constitutional rights. He ordered sweeping reforms, including improved medical care, mental health screening, and tighter oversight of yard releases. But for many inmates, the ruling came too late. Lives had been lost or permanently scarred. Families had buried sons whose only crime inside was stepping into the wrong yard. And the public had glimpsed, for the first time, the dark underbelly of California's toughest prison. In the closing weeks of the trial, a sealed exhibit surfaced, a grainy videotape shot by a tower officer during one of the yard incidents. The footage, later obtained by journalists, showed two men circling each other on the concrete while guards looked on from behind riot shield. A dog barked off-screen. The fight ended with one man bleeding, the other prone. The tape cut off as pepper spray filled the air. Whether it proved a gladiator fight or simply a security breach, it became an icon of Pelican Bay's darkest era. And then, just as the case seemed settled, new rumors emerged that some of the fights had been part of a covert intelligence gathering program aimed at flipping gang leaders into informants. Attorneys couldn't confirm it, but prisoners insisted they were pawns in a larger chess game. If true, it meant the blood spilled on Pelican Bay's yard wasn't just the result of rogue officers. It was an unofficial strategy. That possibility is where our story turns. Because as the cameras faded and the public moved on, evidence of something deeper, something even more sinister, began to surface in sealed depositions and whistleblower statements. One name in particular kept appearing, a mid-level supervisor whose career path intersected every major incident. The shadow behind the fights. The sealed depositions whispered the same name, Lieutenant Randall McKee. To the public, McKee was a mid-level supervisor, a man with a clean record and a calm, bureaucratic smile. Inside Pelican Bay, however, he was known as the broker, not because he traded stocks, but because he allegedly brokered power between gangs and guards. Inmate affidavits described a figure who knew every rivalry, every grudge, every upcoming yard release. Yet nothing tied him directly to violence. Nothing, until one prisoner slipped a note under his attorney's door claiming McKee had promised him protection in exchange for putting on a show against a rival. The attorney, a young public interest lawyer named Carla Sweeney, didn't know what to make of it. She'd cut her teeth on minor parole cases and only recently joined the Pelican Bay litigation team. Now she held a scrap of paper that hinted at an organized program of orchestrated bloodshed. "Find the logbooks," the note said. "They show who was on duty. Follow the pattern." That night, in her San Francisco office, Carla spread out yard release rosters obtained through discovery. At first glance they looked like bureaucratic noise: names, dates, cell numbers. Then she saw it. A repeated pairing of enemy factions scheduled minutes apart, always under the same shift supervisor. The pattern went back years. Carla brought the evidence to lead counsel, Steve Fama, who cautioned her to slow down. "We can't accuse a lieutenant without proof," he warned. But the more they dug, the clearer the pattern became. Even the medical incident reports lined up. Stabbings, slashings, broken jaws, all under McKee's watch. Meanwhile, prisoners continued to send coded letters out of the SHU. One described guards wagering on outcomes, another claimed a camera had been moved to give a better view of the fight. Nothing was confirmed, but the mosaic of rumors formed a chilling picture. Inside Pelican Bay, word spread that the plaintiff's lawyers were onto something. Inmates who had cooperated with depositions suddenly refused to talk. One was transferred to Corcoran without explanation. Another was found beaten in his cell after a supposed fall. Carla began receiving late-night phone calls from blocked numbers, a man's voice breathing heavily before hanging up. She reported it to the U.S. Marshals but was told there was little they could do without a threat. Still, she kept going. Back in San Francisco, Carla cross-checked the notebook against official record. The local sheriff called it a suicide, but no body was recovered. Carla stared at the news report in shock. First Jimenez, now Dalton. The pattern was clear. Anyone who tried to expose the program was silenced. She returned to her office to find a plain envelope on her desk with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a grainy still frame from a security camera showing McKee in the control booth, pointing toward the yard. Scrawled on the back were two words: next tape. That night she sat alone in her apartment, blinds drawn, the envelope on the table. Somewhere out there was a tape that could blow the case open, and someone was willing to risk everything to get it to her. But who? And why now? The only thing she knew for sure was that the fight to expose Pelican Bay's darkest secret had just turned deadly. As she picked up the photograph for another look, she noticed a faint set of numbers printed along the edge, a time stamp and what looked like a storage code. It might be the clue to where the tape was kept. Before she could trace it, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number: "Stop digging or you're next." The missing tape. The rain had stopped, but the streets outside Carla's apartment still glistened like oil. She sat at her kitchen table, the grainy photograph spread out beneath a desk lamp. The faint storage code in the corner read, PBS03-1993. She whispered it aloud, committing it to memory. If the code was real, it meant the footage had been archived somewhere inside Pelican Bay's evidence vault. That was where the truth might be buried, and why people were willing to vanish or die to keep it hidden. She called Ortiz, the ex-guard whose notebook had first cracked the pattern. His voice trembled through the receiver. "You have to let this go," he said. "They don't want it coming out." They never did. He told her that after Dalton's disappearance, 2 plainclothes officers had shown up at his mother's house asking about old employment records. Ortiz had burned the last of his note. "I'm not next," he said, and hung up. Carla had no choice but to go deeper. Through a sympathetic contact in Sacramento, she obtained a list of internal storage locations used by the Department of Corrections. One entry caught her eye: Security Housing Unit Video Archive, Crescent City Warehouse. It was a nondescript facility 3 miles from the prison perimeter, used for old training reels and evidence too sensitive to keep on site. If Dalton had smuggled a copy of the tape, that warehouse was her only hope. She drove north under a slate-gray sky, the Pacific crashing on her left. Each mile felt heavier, as if she were crossing into enemy territory. In Crescent City, she checked into a motel under a different name. That night she pored over court filings and deposition transcripts, making notes. The case wasn't just about a few rogue guards anymore. It was about a system that had turned violence into intelligence gathering, sacrificing human lives for control. The next morning she walked into the warehouse lobby posing as an attorney requesting archived footage for litigation. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with weary eyes, asked for a form and ID. Carla slid across her bar card and a copy of the court order she had obtained for video discovery. The clerk's brow furrowed. "You're not supposed to have this," she said quietly. Then, after a long pause, she gestured toward the back. Row C, top shelf. Box labeled PBS-03. Carla's heart pounded as she moved between rows of metal shelving stacked with tapes in white cases. Dust motes danced in the air. She found the box, pulled it down, and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were 3 VHS cassettes dated March 1993. She slid one into the viewing deck in the corner and pressed play. The screen flickered to life with the familiar gray yard of the SHU. 2 inmates stood opposite each other, tension visible even on the grainy footage. Guards lined the perimeter with batons. In the control booth, a man in uniform gestured, the same pose from the photograph. As soon as the cell doors clanged shut, the inmates lunged at each other. Blood smeared across the concrete while officers shouted off-screen. No one intervened for a full minute. When they finally rushed in, one inmate lay motionless, the other screaming in pain. The tape cut to static. Carla's stomach turned. This wasn't an accident. It was choreography. She copied the tape onto a blank cassette she had brought, slipped it into her bag, and returned the originals to the box. But as she left the warehouse, she noticed a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine idling. A man inside lifted a camera. She kept walking, her pulse hammering. That night back at the motel she played the copy again, this time noting every time stamp. Each frame was another nail in Pelican Bay's coffin, if she lived long enough to show it to the court. Meanwhile, inside the prison, Spider Jimenez resurfaced. Through a smuggled message he told Carla he had been moved to a psychiatric unit under a false name but could testify if she could guarantee his safety. "I know where the orders came from," the note read. It wasn't just McKee. The implication was staggering. Someone higher, maybe at headquarters, had signed off on the program. Carla contacted a federal prosecutor she trusted, Marcus Heller, and arranged a clandestine meeting in a coffee shop near Eureka. Heller listened as she described the tape and the threat. He was skeptical but agreed to view the footage. "If what you're saying is true," he said, "we're looking at civil rights crimes under color of law, maybe even RICO." But he warned her the department would fight back viciously. "They'll claim security necessity. They'll bury you in privilege. And if you make it public before it's sealed, they'll accuse you of jeopardizing safety." As they spoke, Carla's pager buzzed with another anonymous message. "Warehouse compromised. They know you took it." She looked out the window and saw a black SUV parked at the curb. 2 men in suits stepped out, scanning the street. Heller ushered her out the back door. "Get somewhere safe," he said. "We'll convene a grand jury if we can. But keep that tape hidden." Back at the motel she stuffed her files into a duffel and drove south through the night. The road curved along the cliffs, rain beginning again. In her rearview mirror headlights appeared, one car, then another. She changed lanes, they changed too. Panic surged. She turned off onto a side road leading to a deserted overlook and killed her lights. The cars roared past, taillights fading into the storm. She sat in the dark, trembling. In her bag was the only proof of Pelican Bay's Gladiator fights. In her hands was a note from an inmate claiming the program reached higher than anyone imagined. And somewhere out there, people were willing to kill to keep it secret. Before dawn, she reached San Francisco and drove straight to a secure safe deposit vault rented under a friend's name. She locked the tape inside. Only then did she exhale. But the danger wasn't over. That evening she returned to her office to find it ransacked. Drawers pulled out, papers strewn across the floor, her computer missing. On the desk sat a single item. Her own photograph, taken from outside the motel window, a red X scrawled over her face. The message was unmistakable. She had crossed a line. And now the people behind Pelican Bay's darkest secret knew exactly who she was. The chapter closes with Carla standing in the wreckage of her office, the city's lights blinking through the window like distant signals. In the vault a few miles away lay the tape that could expose everything, if she survived long enough to use it. Exposing the arena. The safe deposit vault felt like a lead weight in Carla's mind. Every time she walked into court or sat at her desk, she imagined the tape sitting in the dark, waiting. She'd built her case on affidavits, medical records and rumors, but the tape was different. Unfiltered proof. It could win the lawsuit or destroy her career. Maybe both. For weeks she moved like a ghost. She changed hotels, avoided routine, encrypted her note. She and federal prosecutor Marcus Heller met in public parks or crowded cafes to plan next move. Heller had begun quietly interviewing ex-guards and piecing together financial records. What he found confirmed Carla's worst suspicions. A line item in a confidential budget code for special yard operations, approved not by McKee but by a deputy director at headquarters in Sacramento. The program wasn't a rogue lieutenant's hobby. It was sanctioned from the top. Spider Jimenez was the key. Hidden in a psychiatric wing under a false name, he was willing to testify that he'd been pressured to fight in exchange for privileges and threatened when he refused. Heller arranged to move him into federal custody as a material witness. For the first time, Carla felt a glimmer of hope. With Jimenez's testimony and the tape, the curtain would finally drop. Then, 2 nights before Jimenez's transfer, a fire broke out in the psychiatric unit. Officially it was an electrical fault. Unofficially it looked like arson. Jimenez survived but suffered smoke inhalation and was moved under guard to a hospital. "They're trying to shut me up," he rasped from his oxygen mask. "You have to show the tape." Carla squeezed his hand. "I will," she said. "I promise." She and Heller decided to go public before anyone else disappeared. They scheduled a press conference in San Francisco, coordinated with national outlet. On the morning of the event, Carla retrieved the tape from the vault, her hands trembling as she clutched the case. Outside the courthouse, cameras lined the steps, reporters shouting questions. She mounted the podium and began. "For years, the state of California has denied that its officers staged violent confrontations between inmates at Pelican Bay State Prison. Today, we can prove otherwise." She held up the tape. Flashbulbs exploded. Heller stepped forward to announce a federal civil rights investigation. But before they could play the footage, a process server approached the podium with a court order, an emergency injunction from a Sacramento judge sealing the tape on grounds of institutional security. The press murmured. Carla's jaw tightened. "This is exactly why we're here," she said into the microphones. "They want the truth buried." That afternoon, as legal teams battled over the injunction, someone leaked the tape online. A grainy clip appeared on a small activist website, guards standing back as 2 inmates fought, blood on the concrete. Within hours it spread across forums and evening newscasts. Gladiator fights at Pelican Bay scrolled across cable news. Politicians who had praised the prison now demanded answers. The governor called for an emergency review. In Sacramento, the deputy director who had approved special yard operations resigned. Inside Pelican Bay, the SHU went on lockdown. McKee was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Federal agents executed search warrants for internal memos and training manuals. Families of injured and killed inmates began filing new lawsuits. The code of silence cracked under pressure. More guards came forward, confirming the pattern of orchestrated fights and cover-ups. One described a betting pool on yard outcomes. Another admitted that intelligence gathering had been the pretext. But victory was bittersweet. Dalton was still missing. Ortiz remained in hiding. Jimenez's health deteriorated from smoke damage, and though he testified by video, his face was gaunt, his voice hoarse. In court he said, "We were treated like animals in a pit." The guards watched. They wanted blood. His testimony, combined with the leaked tape, became the spine of Madrid v. Gomez and related suit. Judge Henderson's final order condemned Pelican Bay's SHU as violating the Eighth Amendment, ordered sweeping reforms, and banned the yard release practices described. Carla stood outside the courthouse as the ruling was read, cameras flashing, reporters shouting her name. She felt no triumph, only exhaustion. She had spent years pushing against a wall of secrecy and fear. Now the wall had cracked, but behind it were scars no order could erase. Weeks later she received a plain envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a single photograph. Dalton, alive, standing on a dock somewhere tropical, smiling faintly. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "You did it. Stay safe." She never heard from him again. Pelican Bay still stands on the foggy northern California coast, its concrete walls visible from Highway 101. The SHU has been modified, its policies rewritten, but the legend of the Gladiator fights lingers, a cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked behind closed doors. In the prison yard where blood once stained the concrete, new exercise pens sit empty under a pale sky. Carla walks there sometimes during legal tours, the sea wind carrying the scent of salt and pine. She thinks of the men who fought, the ones who died, the ones who testified. She thinks of the tape locked in a vault, now a public record, and how close it came to disappearing forever. And she thinks of the viewers watching stories like this one, trying to make sense of a system built on punishment but not always on justice. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you've seen how deep the shadows can go. Pelican Bay's Gladiator fights were not just a scandal, they were a mirror held up to power. And if this story unsettled you, remember, there are more secrets still hidden behind walls like these. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.